One of those real problems that you just raised is a massive addiction crisis, probably the worst in our nation's history. And you see life expectancy actually going down
Yeah,
at the same time that, to your point, the stock market's doing great and unemployment's low and GDP is doing well. So there's clearly something wrong,
yeah, there's
sort
a
of
massive
at the
disconnect.
core of
Completely.
society. Specifically on the addiction crisis, how does your view of addiction differ from sort of the current regime? How would you change the way that we deal with addiction in this country?
No, it's a similar principle, Crystal, where we're excessively punitive in this country. And that if you become addicted, then somehow we're like, well, tough it out, recover on your own.
We see it as a moral failing.
Yes, we can tell it's a structural problem, and you can see that with Purdue Pharma now on the verge of bankruptcy because it's forfeiting billions of dollars in blood money. I mean, the federal government was negligent in allowing us to get to a point where you had hundreds of thousands of opiate prescriptions. You had more opiate prescriptions in the state of Ohio than people in the state of Ohio at one point, and that was on the government's watch. And then we somehow hold individuals accountable for becoming addicted when you had companies that profited to the tune of tens of billions of dollars on the backs of those addictions. And so right now we have to own up to our own government's failings and responsibility and say, look, this plague is our fault, at least in part. So we need to put the resources to work to help people get well, even though this is not a monetary problem, this is a human problem.
Right.
But then the second thing is we have to stop punishing people for becoming hooked on these drugs. We have to say, look, if you're an addict, we're going to refer you to treatment and not a prison cell. I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. I mean, does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. I mean, at this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin,
right,
which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done? Because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. I mean, is that essentially, is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites. And I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail and letting them know this. And I was inspired in part by a high school student in Iowa who said to me, his classmates have fentanyl patches on their arms, they're already addicted, what are we going to do? And I realized that those teenagers would never seek treatment because it's an illegal substance. And that if they got a criminal record, then they would think that their life could be, due for a huge change for the worse.
Yeah.